200 classmates. My educational giant is Thomas Gallaudet, and I chose to do my report on him because what he has done for education is really near and dear to me, but I will get to that later. So anyway, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on December 10th, 1787. At the ripe age of only 14, Gallaudet and his parents, Peter Gallaudet and Jane Hopkins, moved to Hartford, Connecticut so that he could begin college at Yale University. After only 3 years, Thomas graduated with his degree in education at the top of his class. He then entered grad school, again at Yale, and received his master's. Although he had studied education, his religious Protestant background eventually led him to become an ordained minister in 1814, but even that did not last for long. Gallaudet's goal to serve as an itinerant preacher was put aside when he met Alice Cogswell, the 9-year-old deaf daughter of a neighbor, Dr. Mason Cogswell. Thomas did not know sign language, so he tried the best that day to communicate with Alice. Thomas attempted to communicate with Alice by pointing at his hat and writing H-A-T in the sand. She understood him, and he was inspired to teach her more. Alice changed the path of life that Thomas once thought he would take. He now strived to do something completely different than anyone had ever done. He wanted to help people like Alice. Because there were no deaf schools at this time in the United States, Gallaudet needed to venture outside of the U.S. to study methods to help teach students like Alice. Alice's father, Mason Cogswell, was a very wealthy doctor who funded Thomas's entire trip to England, where he could study the schools for the deaf. He did not receive the information he needed, unfortunately, but he did meet two men, Laurent Clerc and John Massow, who allowed Gallaudet to accompany them back to France to learn more about specific teaching methods for deaf students. Gallaudet soon ran out of funds, though, unfortunately, and could no longer stay. He had to return to the U.S., but thankfully one of those educators, Laurent Clerc, returned with him graciously to the United States. It was actually kind of funny. On the plane ride back to the United States, Clerc taught Gallaudet sign language, and Gallaudet taught Clerc English. And after they returned and talked and decided what they needed to do, Gallaudet determined that ASL, which is American Sign Language, was the most efficient way to teach deaf students, and he, together with Clerc, opened the first American school for the deaf in 1817. After that milestone of opening the school for the deaf students, Gallaudet eventually married his wife, Sophia Fowler, and together he and his wife had 8 children. Thomas died, unfortunately, in Hartford on September 10th, 1851. Gallaudet's youngest son, Edward, followed in his father's footsteps and later opened a school for the deaf in Washington, D.C. That school eventually became what a lot of us have heard of today, which is Gallaudet University, and that was in 1864. The charter for the school was signed by President Abraham Lincoln and was named in honor of Thomas Gallaudet. Gallaudet University is still around today and is considered to be a very prestigious college for both deaf and hearing students. Out of all the accomplishments made by Gallaudet, I think his main contribution was establishing the American School for the Deaf. Not only did this allow for schools to specifically have schools for deaf students, but it brought awareness to the fact that deaf people could learn just as much as hearing people with the right tools and the awareness. Before Gallaudet, deaf students rarely attended school and were considered dumb. Actually, the term deaf and dumb was used often, and that reminds me that I've actually heard one of my professors, when I was taking some childhood education classes at my junior college, we were talking about culture and diversity, and we got onto the topic of deaf students, and one of my professors actually used this term, and I still couldn't believe that people today use that term, but it is still around today. So educating people on the deaf community, and like that they are just like we are, is important. But because the means of teaching was through American Sign Language, it made it so much easier for deaf students to learn. Before American Sign Language, they were forced to read lips or constantly write things down, which writing things down is really time-consuming, and it's not really that easy for people to understand that it's not that easy for deaf students to read lips. It's actually a known fact that hearing people can read lips better and more efficiently because we know the sounds that are coming out, so we know what mouth shapes to look for, and deaf students, they could never hear it, so they don't know exactly what the sounds are that are coming out. They can be taught that, but they've never actually heard it, so it's not as easy for them to do. With ASL, American Sign Language, communication between students and teachers was much faster, and deaf students were able to learn more efficiently. Gallaudet created a sense of equality between deaf and hearing people. He made it known that, with the proper tools, deaf people were capable beings just like everyone else. Gallaudet's name and legacy is still around today. Gallaudet University is still a well-known university in Washington, D.C. for both deaf and hearing students. Hearing students are only allowed to attend for their master's degree, but deaf students can attend whatever type of education they choose. The university is geared towards the advancement of education for students who have hearing loss and/or speech disabilities, and in line with Gallaudet's aims, is equipped to provide them with an equal opportunity for success. I've heard the application process for that school for hearing students is very competitive. You can, like I said, you can only attend if you're going for your master's, because it is specifically cut out for deaf students, but it is very hard to get in for hearing students, and a lot of people do try because they want to go for different degrees involving the deaf education, but it's very hard to get into. But because of Gallaudet, there are preschools, elementary schools, high schools, colleges for the deaf all across the country that aim for equal opportunity for deaf students. And some of these deaf students eventually become teachers, lawyers, educators, anything you can think of. And they can become a part of our lives at one point or another, so we should be educated on them and how to help them if they need help, and how to treat them. The only thing different about them is that they can't hear. That's it. And Gallaudet is the one who has shown us that they're fully capable, and he created a movement to remove that negative stigma back in 1817 when he opened that first school for the deaf. I personally am thankful for Gallaudet's contributions in many ways. If he had never taken an interest in Alice Cogswell and eventually opened the first school for the deaf, I would never have pursued my deaf studies career, or not career, but interest in deaf studies, and I never would have learned sign language. I've also grown to love the deaf community, and as an initial deaf studies major, which is what my initial major was, I was assigned to attend various deaf events as a student, where I communicated and got to know different people that were deaf, and those were really neat. We would go to places like Starbucks or a pizza place, and we would meet up with various members of the deaf community, and they would just sign with us and communicate with us, and it was so neat to just interact with them and learn their language, because it's a really fun language to learn. It was an amazing experience, and I think what I love most about being educated about deaf people is that I can educate others who may feel prejudiced towards or uncomfortable around deaf people, because I've had friends that have told me, like, oh, I saw this deaf person and they made me feel uncomfortable, or I didn't know what to do or to say, which they shouldn't really say anything. They should maybe write down or like wave a hello or something, but they should never feel uncomfortable or anything like that. And I feel lucky to have the skills to help those kinds of people, and it wouldn't be for Gallaudet without that. And lastly, I am thankful for Thomas Gallaudet, because without his accomplishments, I never would have had superb intellectual and deaf college professors, because all of the professors I had throughout all my deaf studies classes, all of those professors were deaf themselves, and they were phenomenal professors, probably some of the best professors I've had, which just shows you can be a professor whether you're hearing or deaf. It doesn't really make a difference. And I never would have fallen in love with sign language if it weren't for Gallaudet. I never would have wanted to become an educator for the deaf myself, and I never would have had such a strong sense of compassion for the deaf community. So I am thankful that he met Alice Cogswell that one day and decided to do something more, because I feel like we need more educators that are willing to help those that are different and make a difference. So, yeah, thank you.